In the Caribbean, there is a city where homegrown fruit and vegetables are being used as a solution to low oil economy. In Havana, more than 2 million people rely on urban farms to grow half their fruit and vegetables. Perhaps this country has lessons for the West. Producing food with a radical cut in oil is a challenge Cuba has already had to meet head-on. For decades, Cuba used to import nearly all of its food. It was able to do that because trade with the Soviet Union was heavily subsidized. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, everything had to change. Cuba had to grow its own food, and it had to use every tiny little bit of space in order to do that, even spaces in cities like Havana.
Before the 90s, Soviet Union sent us all the food. And after the 90s, when the Soviet Union downfall, we had to produce different crops. And we opened all of these spaces to grow food.
Spaces in the city have been opened up, and now there are almost 200 urban farms known as organoponicos in Havana. Emilio Andres works at one of the city's biggest allotments, Alama Organoponico, a cooperative that produces 240 tons of vegetables a year for the local community.
It's important because it's near the city, it's a food for the people, it's a healthy food, and you can provide a lot of jobs for the people too.
As well as limiting fuel cost in transporting the food and labor, the oil shock in Cuba limited the use of oil-based agricultural chemicals. Advocates of the Cuban organoponicos say that this is truly sustainable farming.
It's so important because now there is a big problem in the world, and the price of the food is increasing every day. So if you are available to produce food, you can have the sustainability and you have food security too.
Urban farms in Cuba produce more than 4 million tons of vegetables every year. And the country is now 90% self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables. But it still has to import half of its total food. The health of the nation has improved too. At the time of the oil shock, the average calorie consumption in Cuba dropped by about a third to dangerously low levels. Since then, they've bounced back, and Cubans now eat a similar number of calories to Americans, partly due to the organoponicos. But this low-oil diet is not ideal. It is incredibly limited, with about 3 times less of the food energy coming from animal products like meat and dairy than in the USA. Would developed countries be prepared to give up their burgers and steaks for the Cuban staple of rice and beans? Even if we don't move to the Cuban-style low-oil farming, we may have no choice but to give up much of the meat in our diets. It is the least sustainable form of food we eat. Livestock production uses a phenomenal amount of the world's resources, including a third of the world's free land. Around 700 million tons of cereals are fed each year to cows. Livestock farming accounts for about 10% of water used annually. And cows aren't very good for climate change either. Cows and the cattle business are responsible for nearly a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions. One alternative is to change the way we rear cattle. That's what's happening in the uplands of England, where cows are reared on land that is good for nothing else but grass. British farming is unusual in this way of rearing cattle. Over 80% of the country's cows are fed mainly on grass and not fattened up on corn in the last 6 months of their lives, as many cows raised in other countries are. On this farm in the Yorkshire Dales, a rare breed called Ling has been introduced. They can survive longer out in the fields, so they eat more grass and need less food stock. Dr. Evan Fraser believes this type of cattle farming is the way forward.
This is as sustainable a form of protein that we can get as exists. The cows and the sheep eat that small amount of grass and turn it into something we need. And in doing so, they're fertilizing the next generation of grass, they're keeping the landscape neat and tidy. So it's brilliantly clever. In America, the last 6 to 8 months of a cow's life are spent on feedlots, which means that they're on concrete pens in somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 animals, fed intensive grain diets that are augmented with growth hormones and antibiotics. And it's in that period of time they will essentially double their weight. At the end of the day, the American system is focused on the amount of kilos of beef they can get per dollar invested, and that's it. This system really looks at the animal much more as part of an ecosystem.
It's a seductive argument, but there's a catch. If this type of cattle farming becomes commonplace, the amount of beef on sale would tumble, and of course, prices would rise. We can forget about cheap mints and bargain burgers.
If we went to this sort of model for beef, there's no question we would eat less beef, less people would eat beef, and it would be more expensive. There's no way of rounding that hole or squaring that peg. That's the way it's going to have to be. And people will have to find other sources of protein. But there are abundant other sources of protein, like the grain, which is being fed to the American cows, could be converted into human feed.
The idea that a shift away from mass production is the answer to more sustainable food production is counterintuitive. In the past, the industrialization of farming was the answer to keeping up with increasing food demand.